The snow did not care that she was dying. It fell anyway, indifferent, beautiful, and merciless, blanketing the Ashford Forest in a silence so absolute that Sera could hear her own heartbeat stuttering in her chest like a candle flame fighting against a gale. Her fingers had stopped hurting an hour ago. That was how she knew the cold had moved past cruelty and into something far more dangerous. Numbness was not relief. Numbness was the body giving up the argument. She told herself to keep moving. One foot, then the other. The rejection brand on the back of her neck pulsed with a dull, ugly heat, the only warm thing left on her entire body, as though the pack's magic was determined to remind her, even now, even here, that she had been unmade, cast out, erased. She pulled the thin, stolen blanket tighter around her shoulders and pressed deeper into the tree line, following the frozen creek bed because it was the only path she knew that led away from the Iron Veil Pack's territory and toward the possibility of survival. She almost missed them. She would have, if not for the sound. It was barely a whimper, the kind of noise so small and so desperate that it seemed to belong to a creature who had already half surrendered to the dark. Sera froze. Every surviving instinct she possessed screamed at her to keep walking, to not investigate sounds in the woods at night, to remember that she was a rogue now, and rogues who lingered in foreign territory ended up as cautionary tales told to pups at bedtime. But the whimper came again. And underneath it, so faint she might have imagined it, was a second one. She turned. There, half buried in a drift of snow at the base of a massive oak, were two small wolves. Pups, hardly bigger than her forearm, their dark fur soaked through and matted with something that was not snow. Even in the pale, silver-threaded darkness of the forest, Sera could see the wrongness of their color. Wolves were warm creatures. Their fur held heat like a furnace. These two were the color of ash and moonstone, their little chests rising and falling with a rhythm that was far too shallow, far too slow. Dying. They were dying. Keep walking, the rational part of her said. They are not your pups. This is not your forest. You are already barely alive yourself. Sera dropped to her knees in the snow. She did not make the decision consciously. Her body made it for her, the same treacherous, inconvenient body that had always felt too much, cared too deeply, held on too long. She pulled both pups against her chest, wrapping the stolen blanket around all three of them, and pressed her cold lips to the nearest small head and breathed warm air into dark fur that smelled of pine resin and would smoke in something ancient, something powerful. Alpha blood, she realized. These are alpha-born pups, which meant their father was somewhere in this forest, which meant she had approximately no time at all. The pup in her left arm convulsed. A tiny, terrible shudder that moved through its whole body like a crack spreading across ice. The other went completely still. No, Sera whispered. The word came out raw and cracked, scraped clean of anything except naked refusal. No, you don't. Not tonight. She knew what she was about to do. She knew the cost of it. She had been told, in explicit and vivid terms, exactly what happened to Omegas who used the golden light, who reached down into that forbidden well of warmth that lived below her ribs and drew it upward into her hands. She had been told it was a corruption, a curse, a perversion of the natural order. She reached for it anyway. The golden light came like dawn breaking behind her sternum, slow at first, then sudden, flooding her palms with a warmth so intense it should have burned but instead felt like the memory of every kind touch she had ever received compressed into a single, radiant moment. Her hands began to glow, soft, ember, like firelight trapped beneath skin. She pressed them against the small, failing bodies of two pups she had never met, and she poured herself into them. It was not a gentle process. Healing this deep, healing that had to chase death back from the threshold and drag life forward by its collar, cost something real. She felt it leave her like blood from a wound she couldn't see, Warmth, energy, the particular stubborn brightness that had kept her walking through 3 weeks of winter exile. She gave it freely. She had very little left to protect anyway. The first pup gasped, then whined, then began to squirm against her with all the indignant, furious energy of a small creature that has just been informed it is not, in fact, finished with the world. The second stirred a moment later, slower, as though waking from a dream it wasn't entirely sure it wanted to leave. It turned its small muzzle toward her wrist and pressed its nose there, warm now, wet, achingly alive, and the sound it made was so soft and so trusting that Sera had to close her eyes against the sudden savage ache in her chest. The golden light faded from her hands. The cold came back. Behind her, a branch broke under a weight that was not the weight of any ordinary creature. The growl that followed was not a sound she felt with her ears. It was a sound she felt in her spine, in the oldest, most primitive part of her that remembered, on some cellular level, what it meant to be small in a world that contained things far larger and far more dangerous than herself. It moved through her like a tremor through the earth, low and resonant and absolutely certain of its own authority. "What," said a voice like winter given a throat and a fury, "did you just do to my children?" Sera did not turn around immediately. She took one breath, then another. Then she turned. 3 weeks earlier, the world had still had edges she could map. She had known her place in it, had known it the way you know the shape of a room you've lived in so long you can navigate it in complete darkness. She had been Sera of Iron Vale. Omega-born, yes, but ranked. Third healer of the pack. A position earned not through blood or the brute mathematics of dominance, but through years of quiet, exhausting, meticulous work. Through calloused hands and late nights and a gift she had been very, very careful to keep small, contained, presentable. The Iron Vale pack was not a cruel pack, precisely. It was merely an ordered one. In the hierarchy of the packs that governed the Northern Territories, order was the highest virtue. Every wolf had a designation, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, down through the ranked Omegas, and then, at the very bottom of the structure like sediment at the floor of a lake, the unranked, the dismissed, the burdens. Omegas were already the lowest rung of the respectable ladder, their worth measured almost entirely in what they could offer to the pack's functioning, healing, nurturing, maintaining the emotional equilibrium of the group during the long, brutal winters. They were tolerated, utilized, and managed. They were not, under any circumstances, supposed to glow. Sera had been 17 the first time it happened. A young Delta with a shattered femur, screaming in the snow after a training accident, and her kneeling beside him without thinking, reaching for the part of herself that had always existed but had never been acknowledged, and the golden light coming out of her like breath, like prayer, like something she had no name for. The femur knitted in 4 minutes. The young Delta stopped screaming. The 12 wolves who witnessed it went very, very quiet. The healer matron had taken her aside that evening. Her expression had been the careful, measured kind that preceded bad news delivered with administrative efficiency. "What you did today cannot happen again," she had said. "Golden healing is an aberration. It is not part of the sanctioned gift set of the Omega designation. It has no assigned origin, no recorded lineage, and no predictable limitation. It is, therefore, a liability." Sera had nodded. She had understood the subtext with perfect clarity. You are something we don't have a category for, and things without categories make us uncomfortable, and discomfort in a pack is dangerous. She had spent the next 7 years being very, very small. She had used only the standard, approved methods, herb poultices, bone setting, the minor warmth channeling that all ranked Omegas were permitted to employ in carefully measured doses. She had kept the golden light locked behind her ribs like a secret she was ashamed of, and for 7 years the strategy had worked. She had been useful, unremarkable, safe. Then Elder Draven's grandson had fallen through the ice of the winter lake. He was 9 years old. He was below the water for 4 minutes before they pulled him out. His lungs were full. His heart had stopped. The pack healers worked on him for 7 minutes with sanctioned methods, and the child remained the gray-blue color of a winter sky at dusk, and his mother was making a sound that Sera would hear in dreams for the rest of her life, and Sera had thought, I can save him. I can save him, and I will simply tell them I used the standard technique, and she had saved him. She had not been discreet about it. The golden light, when she'd unleashed it at full capacity for the first time in 7 years, had not been subtle. It had come out of her like a small sun. Every wolf in the immediate area had seen it. Several had stepped backward. Elder Draven himself had gone very still in the way of old, powerful wolves who are recalibrating their threat assessments. The child had woken up coughing and crying and perfectly, entirely alive. The pack tribunal had convened the following morning. She remembered the chamber with the kind of hyperspecific clarity that the mind reserved for moments of profound damage. The long stone table, the 12 elders arranged like a sentence she was about to be handed, the frost on the high windows catching the early light and fracturing it into cold geometry across the floor. She remembered standing in the center of all that arranged authority and feeling very young and very alone. The golden healing is not a gift, Elder Draven had said. His voice was not unkind. It was worse than unkind, it was decided. It is a contamination of the Omega frequency. Documented cases in the historical record describe it as a precursor to instability, to corruption of the pack's energetic field, to the eventual breakdown of hierarchical order in the immediate vicinity of the afflicted individual. The child you save today may suffer long-term effects from exposure to unsanctioned energy. He had paused. You are a danger to this pack, Sera. Not by intention, but by nature. She had wanted to argue. She had opened her mouth to say, I saved a child. I saved a child who would be dead without me, and you are talking about energetic fields and hierarchical order, and I don't understand how those things can matter more than a 9-year-old boy who is alive right now because of what I did. The rejection ritual will be performed at sundown, Elder Draven had continued, as though she had not moved at all. Your rank designation will be stripped and sealed. You will be given 3 days' worth of provisions and escorted to the border of our territory. What happens to you after that is not the pack's responsibility. The rejection ritual had hurt in a way she had not been prepared for. It wasn't the physical pain of the brand, though that was considerable, the pack's magic burning its withdrawal into the skin at the base of her neck like a signature being deliberately, violently crossed out. It was the sensation of disconnection. The pack bond, which she had lived inside for her entire life like warmth inside a house, simply ceased. One moment she was part of something, meshed into the collective awareness of 230 wolves, feeling their emotions like weather, their health like her own pulse, and the next moment she was standing alone inside her own skull in a silence so complete it had a texture. She had stood at the Ironvale border in the dying light of a winter afternoon and watched the tree line close behind the 2 betas who had escorted her out, and she had understood, for the first time in her life, what the word alone actually meant in its fullest and most unforgiving sense. She had been walking ever since. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of sleeping in hollow trees and abandoned burrows, of eating what she could find under the snow, of keeping herself alive through sheer, stubborn, unreasonable refusal to accept that this was where her story ended. The provisions had run out after 4 days. The thin blanket she had scavenged from an abandoned rogue camp was not equal to the task of February in the Northern Territories. She was sick, not dying sick, not yet, but the deep-bone kind of exhausted cold that preceded dying sick by a matter of days. She had been heading nowhere in particular. She had been heading away. That was all. And then she had heard 2 small whimpers in the snow, and she had turned, and now everything was different. She turned and he was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer, staggering scale of him. He stood at the tree line 20 feet behind her, and the trees themselves seemed to recalibrate in his presence, seemed to pull their branches back slightly as though the forest was making room for something it recognized as categorically above it in the order of things. He was in human form, but only just. She could feel the wolf in him pressing against the surface of his skin the way floodwater pressed against a dam, and the dam was the thinnest thing in the world, and it was held in place entirely by the narrow, terrible leash of his control. He was dark. Not in coloring, though he was that too, black hair, skin the deep warm brown of tree bark in autumn rain, dark eyes that caught the moonlight and held it captive. He was dark in the way storms were dark, in the weight of what he was carrying, in the dangerous pressure of the power that moved around him like weather. He wore no coat despite the cold, which told her immediately that he was operating at a temperature of fury that had burned through ordinary physical sensation. His jaw was set with a tightness that suggested every muscle in his face was working to contain something his body very much wanted to express through his throat. The growl was still reverberating through the forest. Through her. She realized she was still kneeling in the snow with his pups pressed against her chest, her hands resting on their small backs, the last faint traces of gold fading from her skin like embers dying. She realized how this looked. A rogue Omega, glowing, alone in the dark, with the Alpha King's children pressed against her body. She did not run. There was nowhere to run, and she was too tired, and some part of her, some deeply exhausted 7 years of being small part of her, was simply finished with the performance of making herself less threatening than she was. She met his eyes. That was a mistake, probably. Omegas did not meet the eyes of Alphas they didn't know. Rogue Omegas certainly did not meet the eyes of Alpha Kings. It was the kind of social transgression that, in the right circumstances, could be treated as a declaration of aggression. She met them anyway because she had just poured most of what remained of herself into keeping his children alive, and she thought that perhaps she had earned 30 seconds of direct eye contact. His eyes were the dark amber of pine resin, or they would have been in another mood in another moment. Right now they were the black of a sky before lightning, the iris swallowed by the enormity of his wolf pushing forward, and the intensity in them was so concentrated, so absolute, that she felt it physically. A pressure behind her sternum, a biological instruction to look away, to lower her head, to make herself small and supplicant and safe. She breathed through it. "I healed them," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. They were dying. Hypothermia and something else. Something that had been done to them deliberately, I think. There was a quality to the cold in their lungs that wasn't natural. She paused. They're stable now. Both of them. Their temperatures are rising and their heart rates are. What are you? The question hit her like a physical force. Not who. What? She noted that. She filed it away in the part of her mind that collected data on how the world intended to categorize her. A healer, she said. Former ranked Omega Iron Veil Pack. Currently rogue. She held his gaze. Currently kneeling in your territory with your children alive in my arms because I chose to stop and help them instead of walking past. The last sentence had an edge she hadn't entirely intended. Exhaustion had stripped away the diplomatic buffering she usually kept between her thoughts and her mouth. Something moved through his expression, too fast, too complex to read. The growl shifted in frequency. Lower. More complicated. He crossed the 20 feet between them in 3 strides, and he moved the way alphas moved at the edge of control, fast and silent, and with the terrible graceful economy of something that did not need to expend effort to be devastating. He crouched before her in the snow, still vastly larger than her even in that position, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating off of him, which was a particular kind of physical irony she did not have the emotional bandwidth to appreciate, and his hands came forward. She did not flinch. She held the pups out to him. His hands, when they took his children from her, were extraordinarily careful. The juxtaposition of it, the size of him, the contained violence of his presence, and then the absolute tenderness with which he gathered two small wolf forms against his chest, was the most unexpected thing she had witnessed in 3 weeks of unexpected things. He pressed his face to their fur, one after the other, breathing them in, and the sound he made was not the sound of an alpha king. It was the sound of a father who had been very afraid. Then he looked back at her, and the father was subsumed again beneath the king, and the king was furious. "Ironvale is 3 territories east of here," he said. "You are significantly outside the acknowledged rogue corridors." His eyes moved across her with the efficient assessment of someone who was reading her condition the way a general read a battlefield, cataloging damage, calculating significance. "Explain." "I was walking," she said. "Away." "From what?" "Everything." She held his gaze. "I wasn't heading toward your territory specifically. I was following the creek bed. I didn't know whose land this was." "You know now." "I know now," she agreed. "I'll leave." She moved to stand and discovered, somewhat humiliatingly, that her body had made other plans. The healing had taken more than she'd realized. She'd been working on a deficit to begin with, and pouring golden light into 2 half-dead pups while already hypothermic and malnourished had called in every remaining debt simultaneously. Her legs did not cooperate. She caught herself on her hands in the snow, which at least was a more dignified failure than simply toppling sideways, and she held that position for a moment, her forehead almost touching the ground, breathing deliberately while the world reorganized itself into something she could navigate. "Get up," she told herself. "Get up right now. You do not collapse in front of an alpha king." "You can't walk," he said. It was not a question. "I can," she said, which was an optimistic reframing of the available evidence. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her. She could feel the calculation in it, the weighing of variables, the particular quality of silence that preceded a decision being made by someone who was not accustomed to having the available options be as inconvenient as these currently were. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not softer exactly. More deliberate. The way a door sounds when it's being opened very carefully, by someone who isn't certain what's on the other side. "You healed my sons," he said, "with magic that should not exist in an omega of your designation. In the middle of my forest. In the middle of the night." Pause. "And you are in no condition to go anywhere." "I'll be fine," she said, still to the snow. "That is," he said, demonstrably false. He shifted his grip on the pups, redistributing their weight against one arm with the ease of long practice, and then his free hand came down and closed around her upper arm, and he drew her to her feet as though she weighed nothing, which at this particular juncture was probably not far from the truth. She found herself standing. She found herself standing because he had decided she would be standing, and the world apparently organized itself according to his decisions. She looked up at him. This close, in the full silver wash of the winter moon, she could see the scar that crossed his jaw, old, deep, the kind left by something that had come very close to being fatal. She could see the exhaustion beneath the fury in his face, the particular hollowed quality around his eyes that suggested he had not slept in a significant number of days. She could see, now that she was paying attention, that he was wearing a grief as old and as settled as furniture, something that had been in residence long enough that he'd stopped noticing it except in moments like this, when it moved. He was not merely an alpha king who had found a rogue in his territory. He was a father who had nearly lost his children tonight. And he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely decode, something between suspicion and something raw, something he was working very hard to keep from having a name. "You'll come with me," he said. It was not an invitation. It was barely even a command in the way that gravity was barely even a suggestion. It was simply the way things were going to be. She thought about arguing. She thought about the brand on the back of her neck and the 3 weeks of exile and the very important principle that she did not, after everything, simply go where powerful men pointed her. She thought about the 2 pups against his chest, breathing steadily, alive. She thought about the way his hands had touched them. "And if I refuse?" she asked, more because she needed to hear what he would say than because she had any actual capacity to refuse. He looked at her for a long moment. The amber was coming back into his eyes. Just at the edges, the wolf retreating by degrees, though his grip on her arm remained absolute. "You won't," he said quietly. And she hated that he was right. His hand remained around her arm as he turned toward the forest. Not cruel, not rough, but entirely immovable, the grip of something that had decided and was therefore done with the question. And Sera walked beside the Alpha King of a territory she didn't know the name of, carrying nothing but a stolen blanket and a secret that had already cost her everything once, and she thought, "Here is where it begins then. Whatever this is, here is where it begins." The forest closed around them both, and the snow fell on, indifferent and beautiful and merciless as it always had. The fortress had no right to be beautiful. Sera told herself this as it emerged from the tree line, as the forest broke open like a sentence ending and the valley below revealed itself in the full, cold radiance of a winter moon, and there it stood, Ashenvale Citadel, the stronghold of the Northern Alpha King, rising from the frozen earth with a particular arrogance of architecture that had never once considered the possibility of being anything less than permanent. It was enormous. It was the kind of enormous that recalibrated your sense of scale for everything else in your field of vision. The trees around it seemed like decorative suggestions, the valley walls like modest proposals. Black stone, dressed with iron, built into the side of a granite ridge as though the mountain itself had decided one winter to grow a fortress and had then thought better of stopping. Towers rose at each corner, not decorative towers, not the romantic spires of the castles in the stories she'd read as a pup, but functional towers, military towers, towers that existed to hold archers and watchmen and the long, unbroken sight lines of a territory that took its own defense seriously. Every window glowed amber from within, firelight pressing against thick glass like something trying to get out, and the light made the black stone look almost warm, which was a lie the building was telling her, and she knew it. The gate was open. That surprised her, and then it didn't, because of course it was open. What lived here did not need a closed gate to feel safe. What lived here was the thing that everything else in the Northern Territories locked its gates against. He walked her through it without stopping. The courtyard beyond was alive with pack members despite the hour, wolves who had clearly been searching, organized into teams now dissolving back into their ordinary configurations, some still in shifted form with snow caked into their fur, some standing in tight knots of conversation that cut off the instant they saw their alpha emerge from the gate. Silence spread outward from his arrival like a stone dropped in still water, and in that silence, every set of eyes in the courtyard found the same thing. The rogue Omega at the Alpha King's side, held in place by his hand on her arm, glowing with the last residual traces of golden light that hadn't entirely faded from her skin. The silence became something else. Something with edges. She felt it the way she had once felt the pack bond, as a collective thing, a shared current. Except where the pack bond had been warmth and connection and the low, steady hum of belonging, this was its precise opposite. This was a cold, unified assessment, and the assessment was not favorable. She watched it move through them. The slight stiffening of shoulders, the micro-expressions of suspicion crystallizing into something more settled, the way several of the wolves nearest to her took a single, unconscious step backward that was not retreat but rather the instinctive establishment of distance from a contaminant. Rogue, their bodies said, in the language bodies used when they thought no one was reading them. Cursed. Unclean. A woman appeared from the main entrance. Beta ranked, Sera assessed automatically, reading her bearing and the quality of authority in her movement. She was perhaps 40, lean and winter-hardened, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now something better, formidable. Her eyes moved from the Alpha King to the pups against his chest to Sera, and her expression performed a rapid, controlled journey through shock, relief, and deep, proprietary suspicion before settling into the careful neutrality of a high-ranked wolf who knew better than to display her reactions to her king. Kael, the Alpha King said, "The pups need a healer and warming baths." Both. Immediately. "Of course, my king." The woman, Kael, stepped forward and took the pups with practiced, gentle efficiency, cradling them against her broad chest with the ease of someone who had done this before. She murmured to them, low, soft sounds, the kind wolves used with pups to indicate safety, and both small forms stirred, recognizing her, relaxing. Then the smaller pup opened its eyes. It looked at Kael. It looked around the courtyard. And then it began to cry, not the quiet, waking whimper of a pup being carried from sleep, but a full, insistent, increasingly frantic sound that carried through the cold air with the specific urgency of a creature that has identified exactly what it wants and is unwilling to accept any substitute. Kael tried motion. She tried murmuring. She tried the particular hold that worked on every pup in the pack, the one that combined compression and warmth and the scent of a trusted beta and never failed. The pup cried harder. Its sibling, roused by the noise, lifted its small head and looked around the courtyard with an expression of focused, accusatory intent until it found what it was looking for, and then it began to cry too. Both pups were looking directly at Sera. The courtyard was very quiet. Sera stood absolutely still inside the king's grip while 20-odd wolves watched two alpha-born pups cry for a rogue Omega, and she understood with perfect clarity that this moment was going to cost her in ways she couldn't yet calculate. The Alpha King's hand on her arm tightened by a fraction. Not pain, she didn't think he intended pain, but noticeable. Present. A reminder. They'll settle, he said. To himself, she thought, as much as to anyone. The pups cried on. Kael looked at her alpha with an expression she was working very hard to keep from being a question. He looked at the pups. He looked at Sera. Something crossed his face that she was becoming familiar with, that rapid internal calculation, the weighing of what he wanted against what was, and his jaw set with the tired precision of a man making a decision he didn't like. "She'll be housed in the East Wing," he said to Kael. "Guarded. She is not a guest." A pause, and then, with the quality of a concession extracted under duress, "But she is to be housed." He released Sera's arm. The absence of his grip was its own kind of information. She had not realized, until it was gone, how much of her remaining warmth had been borrowed from the heat of his hand. The East Wing had not been built for comfort. This was the diplomatic interpretation. The less diplomatic interpretation was that the East Wing had been built for the specific purpose of making whatever was inside it feel the precise degree of its own smallness. The corridor that led to it was narrow and high-ceilinged, the stone walls so thick they ate sound entirely, the torchlight placed at intervals wide enough to generate significant pockets of shadow between each pool of warmth. The whole thing smelled of cold and iron and the particular quality of old stone that had absorbed centuries of damp winters. Not unclean exactly, but mineral. Indifferent. The smell of a place that had held many people and cared about none of them. The room she was given was at the corridor's end. The beta who escorted her, young, broad-shouldered, with the closed expression of someone following orders they personally found distasteful, opened the door without speaking and gestured inside with the efficiency of someone who wanted to complete this interaction in the minimum possible time. Inside, a narrow bed with blankets that were adequate if not generous. A fireplace in which a fire had been recently but reluctantly lit, the flames still establishing themselves with uncertain energy. A single window, small and high on the wall, through which the courtyard below was visible as a pale rectangle of moonlit snow. No basin. No soap. No food. She did not ask for these things. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, and she heard the bolt engage with the flat, definitive sound of a lock that had been well maintained. She stood in the center of the room for a moment, in the growing warmth of the uncertain fire, and she took a breath. You are alive, she told herself. You are inside. You are warm or you will be. The pups are alive. You accomplished the thing you set out to accomplish. This is better than the snow. This was better than the snow. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of something she didn't have a polite name for, the full weight of the last 3 weeks compressing into a single dense, airless moment that she breathed through with the systematic determination of someone who had decided absolutely not to come apart in a room that didn't belong to her. Then she lay down in her clothes, pulled the blankets to her chin, and slept. She was woken by small paws on her chest. She came up from sleep with a gasp, hands raised in instinctive defense, and discovered 2 wolf pups standing on her sternum regarding her with the calm, evaluative confidence of creatures who have already decided the situation is acceptable and are waiting for the human to catch up. How, she said to the ceiling and to the universe in general, did you get in here? The door, she realized, was ajar. The bolt had been engaged, but it had not, apparently, accounted for 2 determined alpha pups who had presumably applied sustained pressure and the particular physics of paired effort until something gave. On the floor beside the door, the young beta guard was asleep in a chair he'd dragged across the threshold at some point during the night, wearing the expression of a man who had fought a battle he hadn't known he was in and lost it without entirely registering the defeat. The larger pup, a male, she thought, or the wolf equivalent, pushed its nose firmly against her jaw. The smaller pressed its whole face into the side of her neck with the boneless, total commitment to closeness that small animals specialized in. Both of them radiated a warmth entirely disproportionate to their size, and the combined scent of them, pine resin and wood smoke and that deep, resonant alpha blood she'd caught in the forest, was doing something strange and structural to the cold place behind her sternum that had been cold for 3 weeks. She put her arms around them very carefully. They both exhaled at once. She lay there in the narrow bed in the east wing of a fortress that had imprisoned her, with 2 pups who were not hers breathing softly against her throat, and the fire had settled into steady warmth during the night, and for the first time in 22 days she thought, maybe tomorrow. Just that. Maybe tomorrow. He found them in the morning. He had told himself he was making rounds. This was true in the sense that he did make rounds. Every morning, every fortress, every wing, a habit so old it existed below the level of decision, simply the thing his body did when it woke. He walked his territory from interior edge to interior edge with the systematic attention of a man who believed, on the basis of considerable experience, that the moment you stopped checking things was the moment something went wrong. He had not specifically intended to check the east wing. He stood in the doorway of the room, the young beta guard having startled awake at his approach and scrambled to something resembling an upright position with the panicked energy of someone who knows they have made a professional error, and he looked at the narrow bed, and he looked at his sons, and something in his chest performed a motion he did not choose and did not welcome. They were asleep. All 3 of them, the Omega and his pups arranged in the unconscious geometry of mutual warmth, the pups tucked against her sides with their small faces turned into her warmth, her arm loose around the nearer one with the reflexive protectiveness of a hold that had been maintained even in sleep. The firelight caught the remnants of gold in her skin. Still there, he noted, still faintly luminous in a way that ordinary healer's warmth was not, a quality that pulled the eye the way fire did, the way running water did, the way things did when they were alive in some deeper sense than the merely biological. She was thinner than she should have been. In the firelight, with her face relaxed and her defenses entirely absent, he could see the evidence of 3 weeks of insufficient food and insufficient shelter in the angles of her face, the shadows beneath her eyes, the quality of stillness that was not rest but recovery, the profound kind that came after the body had been pushed past its designed limits and had simply shut down the less essential functions in order to keep the core running. She had healed his sons with a body that was already failing. He stood in the doorway and did not go in, and he became aware, gradually, then with a sudden and extremely unwelcome acuity, of the smell. It had been there last night. He had noticed it in the forest in the first moment he'd crouched before her in the snow, and he had catalogued it and placed it firmly in the category of irrelevant information and continued operating. But the east wing corridor had been narrow, and he had walked through the ambient warmth of the room for the last 12 hours, and the smell had had time to settle and concentrate and arrange itself into something impossible to misread. It was not a complex smell. It was not a subtle one. It was the smell of pine needles warmed by afternoon sun, of rain on hot stone, of something he had not encountered in 9 years and had not expected to encounter again and had, in fact, organized significant portions of his internal architecture around the certainty of never encountering again. It was his. Or rather, and this was the part he was having difficulty with, he was hers. He took a step back. He took another. He turned and walked back down the east wing corridor with the carefully measured pace of a man who is not, absolutely is not, retreating from a room containing a sleeping rogue Omega with his sons curled against her ribs, and who is definitely not pausing at the corridor's end to press one hand flat against the cold stone wall and breathe with the deliberate, mechanical rhythm of someone overriding a biological instruction through sheer force of will. No, he thought. It was a comprehensive thought. It contained within it 9 years of accumulated reason, beginning with the body of his mate, Lena, who had been taken from him in the ambush that had also taken his beta and 2 of his finest warriors and left his sons without a mother before they were 3 months old. It contained his particular and well-earned understanding of what the world did to things you allowed yourself to need. It contained a rational and evidence-based assessment of what a rogue Omega with forbidden magic and no pack affiliation and the eyes of someone who had been pushed past the reasonable edge represented as a liability to a king with enemies and twin heirs and a citadel full of wolves who needed their alpha to be certain. It did not contain any room for a fated mate bond. It did not contain any room for gold light, or for the way she had held her ground in the snow and met his eyes, or for the way she'd said I'll leave with her legs already giving out beneath her, holding on to pride as the last available currency when everything else was spent. No, he thought again. He pushed off the wall and went to his council chamber and did not think about her for the rest of the morning with a concentration so intense it was functionally indistinguishable from thinking about nothing else. By midday, the fortress had formed its opinion and was not keeping it quiet. Sera heard it in the way that people heard things in hostile houses, in the silences that appeared when she entered a room, in the conversations that continued at reduced volume rather than stopping entirely, which was somehow worse because it meant they didn't consider her worth the courtesy of discretion. She heard it in the particular quality of the service she received from the Omega who brought her a meal at midday, food delivered without eye contact, set on the floor outside the door rather than inside the room, in the way you left food for an animal you didn't trust. She ate it anyway. Hunger had no patience for the finer points of dignity. The pups remained with her through the morning, resisting every attempt at retrieval with a passive stubbornness that she found, in a distant way, admirable. Kael came for them twice. The first time, the smaller pup, she'd begun thinking of him as ash for the color of his winter fur, had simply sat down with the settled immovability of a stone and stared at the beta matron with an expression of serene refusal. The second time, both pups had retreated beneath the bed and communicated their position through a series of small, determined sounds that stopped just short of constituting actual defiance of a ranked wolf, a technicality they navigated with a precision that suggested they were going to be extraordinary politicians when they grew up. Kael looked at Sera through the second attempt's failure. Her expression was not hostile, precisely. It was the expression of a woman doing complex arithmetic on a problem that wasn't giving her clean numbers. "What did you do to them?" she asked. It was the same question the king had asked in the forest, but the texture was different. Less accusation, more genuine inquiry. "I healed them," Sera said. "I don't know why they've bonded to me. I've never—" She stopped. She had been about to say "I've never had a pup bond to me before," but that was both obviously true and somehow too exposing to say to this particular woman in this particular room. "The golden healing," Kael said, "was not a question." Sera looked at her steadily. "Yes." The beta matron was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've read about it. In the archive texts. Very old records." She paused in the doorway, her expression moving through something Sera couldn't entirely track. "The scholars called it aurum vitae, the gold of life. They described it as the highest expression of the Omega healing gift, one that appeared historically only in—" She stopped. Something closed in her face. "I'll send proper food," she said instead, and left. Sera sat with the unfinished sentence and turned it over in her hands like a stone she wasn't sure she wanted to look under. Only in what? Only in Omegas who were going to be trouble, presumably. Only in Omegas who should have been born something else, or who existed at the wrong end of the wrong century, or who had the particular terrible luck of possessing something the world had decided it didn't have a category for. She pressed her back against the headboard and let Ash climb into her lap, and she looked at the small, high window where the winter afternoon was producing a pale and watery light, and she thought about the Alpha King standing in the forest with his fury held in a tight leash and his sons against his chest, and that complicated, fleeting, carefully suppressed expression that she had seen in his face and filed away without yet knowing what to do with. She thought about the way he'd said "you won't," quiet, certain, final, and the way it had settled in her chest not like a threat but like a fact. She was still thinking about it when the door opened and he filled the frame, and whatever expression he had brought with him was not the one she'd been expecting, and the pups abandoned her lap entirely to swarm his feet with small, ecstatic sounds, and he looked at her over their heads with amber eyes that were working very hard to be cold and not entirely succeeding. And behind him in the corridor she could hear raised voices approaching, pack members, more than two, with the particular vocal quality of a crowd that has organized itself around a grievance. "There is a situation," he said, which was, she would later reflect, one of the more significant understatements of her life. "There is a situation requiring your specific—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He tried again. "The pack is calling for a tribunal," he said. "They want you judged as a rogue who used unsanctioned magic within pack territory." His eyes held hers. "Under northern law, the sentence is exile. Or execution." A pause that had weight in it. "The vote requires my seal to be valid." Sera looked at him. "And," she said. The voices in the corridor were getting closer. He looked back at her with that expression she couldn't decode, that complicated, reluctant, furious thing, and said, with the tone of a man who has made a decision he doesn't fully understand and trusts even less, "And I have not given it." The door at the corridor's end burst open. The pack that poured into the East Wing corridor was not a mob. Sera made this distinction carefully because it mattered. A mob was disorganized, emotional, operating on the raw fuel of collective feeling without the tempering structure of hierarchy. What filled the corridor outside her door was something more disciplined and therefore more dangerous. A formal complaint, organized by rank, led by wolves who had taken the time to invoke the specific language of northern law before they came. She could see it in the way they arranged themselves, the higher ranked in front, the others fanned behind in the precise formation that pack law required for a legitimate tribunal petition. Someone had done this correctly. Someone had known exactly how to do this correctly and had moved very quickly. She scanned the front rank and found her. She was tall, nearly the Alpha King's height, which was remarkable, with a kind of beauty that announced itself loudly and expected acknowledgement. Her hair was dark copper, elaborately arranged even at this hour, and her rank insignia marked her as a Gamma First, the highest non-beta designation in the pack structure, the position traditionally held by the wolf most likely to be considered for Luna. Her eyes were the pale, particular green of shallow winter ice, and they moved from the Alpha King to Sera with the calibrated efficiency of someone who had already run the numbers and arrived at a conclusion she found satisfying. She was not surprised to see Sera here. Sera noted that, whatever this was, it had not been assembled in the last 5 minutes. "My king." The woman's voice was low, carefully modulated, carrying the precise degree of deference that stopped just short of actual submission. The voice of someone who had practiced the exact interval between respect and equality and found it useful. The pack invokes Article 17 of the Northern Compact. A rogue has used unsanctioned magic within our territory and currently occupies a room in this citadel as though she were a guest rather than a prisoner. We request formal tribunal proceedings within the day. The Alpha King had not moved from the doorway. He had not looked away from the copper-haired woman. The quality of his stillness was the specific kind that preceded significant weather. "Mira," he said. Just her name. But the way he said it had an entire conversation inside it. A conversation that had apparently been ongoing for some time and had not, from his tone, been going particularly well. Myra's chin lifted by a fraction. "It is the pack's right under the compact." "I know what the compact says." "Then you know a tribunal cannot be refused without cause." She paused, with the timing of someone who had rehearsed. "Unless you're prepared to cite cause, my king." The corridor was absolutely silent. 20-odd wolves in formal complaint formation, watching their alpha be walked toward a corner by a Gamma First who had done her legal homework, and behind him in the doorway a rogue Omega with a rejection brand on her neck and gold in her skin and 2 pups winding around her feet as though she were the safest geography in the fortress. Sera looked at the Alpha King's back. She could see the tension in it, the precise, contained quality of a very large force being held in a very small configuration. She could see him weighing the options, and she could see, with the particular clarity that exhaustion sometimes brought, that there were not many good ones. "The tribunal will be held," he said, "this evening, in the Great Hall." He turned then, partially, not to look at Sera but to address the room in the oblique way of someone being careful about what they were seen to prioritize. "The Omega remains housed and unharmed until the proceeding. Pack law guarantees the accused the right to make their case." He let that settle for a moment. "Anyone who interferes with that guarantee answers to me directly." Mira smiled. It was a small, assured smile that did not involve her eyes at all. "Of course, my king. The pack asks nothing more than proper process." She turned and led the formal complaint back down the corridor with the measured pace of someone who had accomplished what they came to accomplish, and the crowd folded in behind her, and the corridor emptied with the efficiency of a threat that had made its point and was content, for now, to wait. Kael came to help her dress for the tribunal, which Sera had not expected. She brought real food first: warm bread, a bowl of something with meat in it, a cup of tea that was genuinely, specifically hot, and she set it on the actual table rather than the floor, and she did not make eye contact while Sera ate, which was a kind of courtesy that Sera recognized and was grateful for. "You should know what you're facing," Kael said when the food was gone. She was laying out clothing on the bed. Not fine clothing, not the kind that would invite accusations of inappropriate luxury, but solid things, clean things, a deep charcoal dress with long sleeves that would cover most of the evidence of 3 weeks of survival, and a pair of boots that fit, which was more than Sera currently owned. Article 17 covers unauthorized magical practice within pact territory by a rogue individual. The standard sentence is exile to the outer corridor zones, essentially a death sentence in February. The alternative sentence, reserved for cases involving direct harm or malicious intent, is execution. "I know," Sera said. "What you may not know," Kael continued, smoothing the dress with careful hands, "is that the burden of proof runs backward under Northern law for rogue cases. You don't have to be proven guilty. You have to prove innocence." Sera absorbed this. "That's efficient," Kael said in a tone that gave no indication of her personal feelings on the matter. "The tribunal will ask you to demonstrate that your use of the golden healing was not an act of aggression, contamination, or deliberate interference with pack affairs. You will need to explain not only what you did but what you are." She paused. "And that will require you to explain something that most of this pack has never encountered and will instinctively distrust. Accursed Omega." Kael looked at her then, directly for the first time. Her expression was more complex than Sera had been expecting. "I told you earlier I'd read about Aurum Vitae," she said. "I didn't finish the sentence." Pause. The historical texts describe golden healing as appearing only in Omegas who carry the resonance frequency of a destined alpha pairing. The old term was anima aurea, the golden soul. She held Sera's gaze steadily. It was considered, in the older tradition, to be not a curse but a marker, a signal. The silence between them was not empty. "I see," Sera said very carefully. "I thought you should know," Kael said, and picked up the boots and said nothing else about it for the rest of the hour. She walked into the great hall knowing exactly what she was, what she faced, and what she had to say, and she said it clearly and without apology, standing in the center of a room full of wolves who had already decided, and she watched the Alpha King on his high seat above the hall floor, watching her with amber eyes that gave nothing away, and she thought, "I saved your sons. Whatever happens here, I saved your sons, and that is mine, and no tribunal can take it." She won. Not easily, and not without cost. She had to demonstrate the healing on a beta who had a poorly knit old shoulder injury, and the golden light in a room full of hostile wolves was an experience she would not describe as comfortable, and there were several moments when the crowd noise rose to something that had the quality of a verdict being reached without the formality of a vote. But the beta's shoulder, which had ached for 3 years, stopped aching, and the golden light was warm and steady and unambiguously healing in quality rather than harmful, and when she finished and looked up at the hall, she found more faces uncertain than hostile, which was not victory but was the raw material of it. The Alpha King sealed the tribunal's outcome with 2 words: "Case closed." Mira, standing at the tribunal's edge, smiled her small, unmoving smile, and Sera understood with perfect clarity that the legal proceeding had been the opening move, not the strategy. Mira moved like water finding the lowest route, always descending, always finding the path of least resistance toward the goal, never appearing to push. Sera watched her operate over the following 2 days with the reluctant appreciation of someone observing a well-executed technique, even when the technique was aimed directly at her. She was never openly cruel. Cruelty could be pointed at. Mira operated in the space below the threshold of accusation, in the casual comment made just loudly enough, in the task assigned to an Omega subordinate that was specifically designed to place Sera in a position of public difficulty, in the way certain doors seemed to be locked when Sera needed them and unlocked when she didn't. Nothing that could be brought before the king as a grievance. Everything that could be felt as a slow, persistent pressure. On the first day, Sera's meal was delayed until it was cold, 3 times in a row, which was not technically neglect but was an unmistakable message. On the second day, the room she'd been using for the pup's morning care, a warm, south-facing alcove that Kael had quietly arranged for her, was reassigned without notice to a storage function, so that when she arrived with both pups she found it blocked with crates and 2 Omega servants who did not meet her eyes and could not explain who had authorized the change. She adapted. She always adapted. Adaptation was the primary skill set of the perpetually unwelcome. What she could not adapt around was the Alpha King himself. He was everywhere, in the particular way of a person you are trying not to think about. Appearing in corridors she was crossing, present at the edge of rooms she entered, occupying the space of the fortress with the comprehensive naturalness of something that had grown there. She told herself it was simply the reality of living inside his stronghold. Of course she encountered him. The citadel was large but not infinite. Their paths would cross. But there was a quality to the way he occupied space near her that was different from the way he occupied space elsewhere, and she knew this because she watched, carefully, consistently, with the dedicated attention of someone who needed to understand the terrain they were navigating, and what she observed was this. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories moved through his fortress with the contained, automatic authority of a man utterly at home in his own power. He was a fact in every room he entered. People reorganized themselves around him the way water reorganized around stone. Near her, something in that arrangement shifted by the smallest possible degree. He did not soften, that was not the right word for what happened. But there was a quality of attention that was different from how he attended to other things. A watchfulness that was not strategic assessment. When she was in a room, she was in his peripheral awareness with an immediacy that she couldn't entirely attribute to the reasonable wariness of an alpha monitoring an unknown rogue in his home. She told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it, and she knew she was not imagining it, and the knowledge sat inside her chest like a coal. Small, hot, and potentially either warming or incendiary depending entirely on how it was handled. It was on the 3rd evening that Mira made her real move. Sera had settled the pups for the night. They slept in her room now, a situation that had been formally acknowledged by no one and changed by no one, existing in the category of things that were simply occurring, and she had stepped out briefly to find Kael regarding an injury one of the younger betas had sustained during training. She was gone for perhaps 30 minutes. She came back to chaos. The pup she'd named Ash was crying in a way that split the air, high and distressed and containing real pain rather than simple unhappiness, and the corridor outside her room was full of people, and Mira was at the center of them with an expression of carefully constructed anguish, holding Ash against her shoulder, and the pup had a mark on his front leg that was wrong. "I found him like this," Mira said to the gathering crowd, to the 2 betas who had come running at the sound. Her voice was exactly calibrated, not accusatory, simply devastated. "I was passing the corridor and I heard him crying. The door was open. She wasn't here." A pause that landed like a stone. "The mark looks like a burn." The crowd looked at Sera. Sera crossed the room in 5 steps and took Ash from Myra's arms with a decisiveness that brooked no negotiation, and Mira allowed it with the graceful restraint of someone making a tactical choice about when to resist. Ash pressed his face immediately into Sera's neck and the crying reduced to a series of shuddering exhales, and Sera ran her hands over him with a healer's focus. Systematic, thorough, reading the truth of the injury the way the body always told it. The mark was not a burn. It was a contact reaction. She'd seen them before in pups who had been exposed to certain pack magic compounds. It was specific, and it was temporary, and it was the kind of thing that resulted not from heat applied to skin but from a reactive compound applied in a small amount to a precise location by something much smaller than a hand. Something like the applicator end of a gamma rank ring. Sera looked up from Ash's leg. She looked at Myra's right hand. Myra's rank ring was on her index finger, a thick band of worked silver with a raised seal, the kind worn only by Gamma First wolves, the kind that had a hollow in the seal setting for the traditional pack magic concentrate used in certain formal ceremonies. The setting was empty. It was always empty in ordinary circumstances. The concentrate left a specific residue. It had a smell that wolves could detect, and Sera's healer senses were, after everything, substantially sharper than ordinary. "May I examine your ring?" Sera said into the watching silence. Myra's expression did not change. "I beg your pardon?" "Your rank ring. The setting. May I examine it?" A beat, a single fractional pause that contained a great deal, and then Myra's chin came up by the same small increment Sera had already learned to read. "I don't see what that has to do with—" "The mark on his leg is a pack magic contact reaction," Sera said. She kept her voice completely level. She was aware that the corridor had gone very quiet, and that the quality of the silence had shifted from the hostile consolidation of people watching an accused rogue fail to something more uncertain and therefore more dangerous. "It is not a burn. It cannot be caused by heat or pressure. It can only be caused by direct application of a pack magic compound to the skin." She held Myra's gaze. "The Gamma First ring contains the highest concentration of pack magic compound used in this fortress. And the concentrate leaves a molecular residue for approximately 40 minutes after application." She did not say, "And I can smell it on your ring from here." She didn't need to. The sound from the corridor's end was not announced by footsteps. Or rather, the footsteps were there, but her attention had been so entirely concentrated on Mira that she processed them only retrospectively, only after the crowd nearest the corridor's entrance had parted with the instinctive, unanimous movement of wolves clearing a path for something that outranked them categorically. The Alpha King stood at the corridor's end. He had clearly been in a meeting. He was still in council dress, the dark, severe clothing that marked formal pack business, and there were two advisors visible behind him who had the expressions of people who had been following their king down a corridor in the middle of a sentence and were now processing that the sentence was over. His eyes moved from Ash in Sera's arms, to the mark on the pup's leg, to Mira, to the ring on Myra's hand, with the rapid efficiency of someone whose threat assessment had been honed by years of needing to be right the first time. The silence was the most complete thing Sera had ever stood inside. "Mira," he said. The same way he'd said it at the tribunal petition. The same word, but with a weight underneath it now that had not been there before. The weight of a conclusion being reached, a patience being ended, a particular long-standing arrangement being permanently revised. Myra's composure was extraordinary. Even now, even under that voice with that weight in it, she maintained the surface, steady, poised, performing a version of innocent confusion that was technically flawless. "My king, I was only—" "Show me the ring." 3 words. But the quality of them, the absolute, immovable certainty, reached into Myra's performance and simply ended it, the way a hand smothers a candle. Mira held out her hand. He crossed the corridor in 4 strides, and he did not take the ring gently, and he did not perform an analysis because he did not need to. He was an Alpha King. His senses had been sharpest in this pack for 15 years, and the smell of pack magic concentrate recently deployed from a ring setting was not subtle, and his pup had a mark on his leg that was not a burn, And the rogue Omega who was supposed to have caused this injury was standing here with his son pressed against her shoulder and her hands shaking very slightly with the residual anger of someone who has been accused of hurting a child. He looked at Mira for a long moment with an expression that had no warmth in it at all. Not fury, nothing as manageable as fury, but a cold, settled reckoning. "You are suspended from your rank privileges pending formal review," he said. "You will not be in any space occupied by the pups until that review is complete. You will not be in any space occupied by," a fractional pause, "by the healer." He did not call her a rogue. The corridor full of wolves noted this. "If you approach her again, you will answer the full consequence of Northern law regarding deliberate harm to an alpha's pups." Myra's mask cracked. Just for a moment, just at the edges, in the places where it had been maintained for longest and had grown thin. Something real moved through her expression. Not guilt, not remorse, but the sharp and genuine shock of someone whose calculus has been revealed as fundamentally wrong. She had believed something about the Alpha King that was not true. She was revising it now in real time at considerable cost. She left the corridor without another word. He turned to the watching crowd with an expression that was the compressed equivalent of a very long speech, and the crowd processed it in the 3 seconds of direct eye contact he gave them before looking away, and then dispersed with the quiet efficiency of people who had been given clear information and knew what to do with it. He turned to Sera last. He stood a foot from her, and she could feel the heat of him again. That particular warmth she'd noticed in the forest, too intense for ordinary body temperature, the warmth of a wolf whose inner fire ran hotter than the human average, and she thought about what Kael had not finished saying and she made herself not think about it. He looked at Ash, who was now making small sleepy sounds against her collar, and something moved through his face that was the same expression she'd seen in the forest when he'd pressed his face to his son's fur. The real one, the father one, the one that lived below the king. "He'll be fine," she said. "The reaction will resolve by morning. It doesn't cause lasting harm." "I know," he said. He was still looking at his son. Then, without preamble, without the architecture of transition that people normally built around significant statements, "I don't believe you hurt him." She looked at him. "You didn't need to say that publicly," she said. "No," he agreed. He looked up from Ash and met her eyes, and the amber was very direct and very present, and the thing she'd been telling herself she was imagining moved through the space between them with the quiet, undeniable fact of weather. "I know." He lifted one hand and touched Ash's ear, a brief, careful gesture, the back of 2 fingers against dark fur, and his hand was close enough to her jaw that she felt the warmth of it, and neither of them moved for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have, and his eyes were complicated and unreadable and honest in a way that was completely at odds with being unreadable. Then Ash sneezed enormously, and the moment broke and he stepped back and she breathed, and the corridor was just a corridor again. "Get some sleep," he said with the stiff, retreating authority of someone rebuilding walls they've just realized have developed a structural problem. He left. She stood holding his son and thinking about warmth, and told herself very firmly that she was a rogue Omega with a rejection brand and no pack and a gift that 2 different groups of people had tried to take from her, and she was not in the business of standing in corridors thinking about the proximity of an Alpha King's hands. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. On the 4th day he brought her to his library. Not personally, he sent Kael with the message delivered in the 3rd person with the stiff formality of someone who was being careful, which told her more than the message itself. The king requests the healer's presence in the Western Library at the 2nd hour after midday. Not commands. Not orders. Requests. She put the word in her pocket and carried it around for an hour before she was ready to take it out and look at it properly. The library was the opposite of the East Wing in every way that mattered. It was vast and warm and layered with a particular amber light that came from a combination of deep firelight and afternoon sun through wide, south-facing windows. It smelled of old paper and pine smoke and the same deep, resonant warmth that she was learning, against all reasonable judgment, to associate with him. Every wall was shelves, floor to ceiling, the books old and well used, their spines worn in the manner of things that had been read rather than kept. A reading table dominated the center of the room, large enough to seat 8, currently occupied by a single spread of maps and several open texts. He was standing at the far window when she entered, looking out at the training ground below, where a group of younger wolves were running forms in the snow. He was in a simpler version of himself than she'd seen in the formal settings. Dark wool, no insignia, his hair not entirely managed, which was a detail she categorically refused to find endearing. "Kael told me what anima aurea means," he said without turning around. Sera went very still. "I see," she said. "The old texts are not subtle about it." He turned then. He had been carrying an expression on the walk to the window that he'd had time to organize into something more controlled, but the organizing was visible. She could see the scaffolding. A golden gifted Omega presented as the fated mate of a ruling Alpha, specific to pack line, unrepeatable, historically documented in 3 confirmed cases over 6 centuries. 3, she said. 3. He met her eyes. 2 of those cases ended in the pairing. One ended in the Omega being executed by a tribunal before the bond could be acknowledged. He paused. Her pack called it a curse. The fire crackled. The afternoon light moved through the room. "I'm not asking you for anything," Sera said. The steadiness of her own voice surprised her. "I didn't come here to be someone's fated mate. I came here because 2 pups were dying in the snow and I couldn't walk past them. Whatever the bond is, whatever the historical texts say about it, I'm not here to claim something from you. I'm aware of what I am in this fortress and what I'm not." He looked at her for a long time. "What are you in this fortress?" he asked. It was a genuine question. She could hear that it was genuine, and the genuineness of it was somehow the most disarming thing he had done in 4 days, including the corridor with Mira and the warmth of his hand near her jaw. "A tolerated prisoner," she said. "For now." Something crossed his face. "For now," he repeated, and she couldn't tell if it was agreement or amendment. He crossed to the reading table and she came to stand across from him, and they spent 2 hours going through the old texts together, the historical records of anima aurea, the documented cases, the pack law implications and the biological mechanism of the bond as the old scholars had understood it. He asked questions with the focused precision of someone who read extensively and thought carefully, and she answered them honestly, and somewhere in the second hour the space between them at the table compressed from the formal distance of an alpha and a prisoner to something closer to the distance of 2 people engaged in the same problem. She noticed when it happened. She didn't think he allowed himself to. That evening, for the first time, she ate at the main table. It was not a grand gesture. He didn't announce it, didn't frame it. Kael appeared at her room at the dinner hour and said, "The king asks that you eat with the household this evening," and Sera had nodded and gone, and she sat at the far end of the table where the Beta household staff ate, which was appropriate and uncontested, and the pups sat under her chair for the entire meal and ate the food she passed to them while their father sat at the head of the table 40 feet away and did not look at her more than 3 times, which was 2 more times than he looked at anyone else. The pack observed all of this, silently, recalibrating. After the meal, when the hall was clearing, the pup she'd privately named River, for the way he moved, constantly fluid, always in motion, scrambled up onto the bench beside her and pressed his entire small body against her arm and made a sound that was not a word but contained all the structure and intent of a declaration. She put her hand on his back. She looked up and found the Alpha King standing at the hall's entrance, watching this. He looked at her, directly, without the careful management she'd been seeing all day, and the amber in his eyes was very warm and very complicated, and she felt the bond move through her like the note of a bell that starts in the chest and radiates outward, and she felt him feel it too, because his expression did the thing she'd been watching it do all week. It went still, and then it went complicated, and then it went back to controlled, except the control was slightly less complete than it had been the time before. He was losing the argument with himself. She thought, I am also losing the argument with myself. She thought, this is very inconvenient. She thought, he is a man who has been carrying a grief for 9 years and has organized his entire interior life around the certainty that he is finished with needing things, and I am the worst possible person for him to need, and he knows that, and he is right, and I cannot seem to make myself care about that the way I should. River sneezed on her sleeve. She picked him up. The Alpha King said her name, Sera, for the first time instead of the healer or the rogue or you, and the sound of it in his voice was enough that she had to look down at River very intently for a moment to manage her expression. Yes, she said. Kael will move you to better quarters in the morning. He said it with the weight of a decision being stated rather than proposed. In the main wing. Closer to the pups. She wanted to ask what this meant. She wanted to ask what she was now, not a prisoner but not a guest, not a rogue but not yet anything with a name, and she wanted to ask it in the context of the library and the corridor and his hand near her jaw and the bond that was growing between them with the patient, inexorable energy of something that had been waiting a very long time. She didn't ask. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded. He left. She sat in the emptying hall with his son asleep in her arms and the fire burning down to amber, and she thought, I should be careful. She thought, I am already too late to be careful. She was deep in the first real sleep she'd managed in 4 days when the sound split the night open. It was not a single bell. It was every bell, all of them, the full warning array that ran from the watchtowers to the gate to the interior alarm system that she had not known existed until this moment, all firing simultaneously in the specific pattern she had never heard but recognized instinctively as what it was. Not a drill. Not a test. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, her healer's reflex dragging her upright in the dark, and the pups were awake too, and River had shifted in his alarm into his small wolf form and was pressed against her leg with his hackles raised, and Ash was crying, and through the narrow high window the darkness outside was not the clean darkness of a winter night but something else, something that moved and flickered, and smelled of smoke and iron and the specific unmistakable sharp note of blood. The door to her room burst open. Kael, fully armed, she had not previously considered that Kael owned weapons, and revised that assessment rapidly, filled the frame with an expression that was completely controlled and therefore completely terrifying. Get the pups, she said. Do not use the main corridor. Follow me. What's happening? Sera said, gathering both pups against her chest, her heart already in her throat. Kael looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, the beta matron looked afraid. Riven pack, she said. They came from the north. All of them. Pause. Someone told them the king's pups are unprotected. Someone told them. Sera looked at Kael. Kael looked back. Mira, Sera said. Move, said Kael. Behind them, from somewhere deep in the fortress, came the sound of the Alpha King's roar, vast and ancient and shaking the stone, and in it was a fury so absolute it had crossed into something that no longer had a human name, and somewhere in the burning dark outside the narrow window a battle was beginning, and Sera ran. The fortress corridors were not built for running. Sera learned this with her body rather than her mind, learned it in the low archways that forced her to duck without breaking stride, in the sharp corners that had to be taken wide, in the uneven flagstones that the citadel's occupants had learned by long familiarity to avoid and that she navigated by luck and instinct alone. Kael moved ahead of her with the muscle memory efficiency of someone who had walked these passages in darkness for years, and Sera followed the sound of her boots and the warmth of her presence and held the pups against her chest and ran. Ash and River were silent now. That was the most frightening thing. More frightening than the bells, more frightening than the smell of smoke thickening in the air with each corridor they passed through. Pups cried when they were afraid. These two had gone past fear into the still, compressed watchfulness of very young wolves who had encountered something their bodies recognized as categorically beyond ordinary danger. They were pressed flat against her, faces turned inward, and she could feel their hearts against her ribs, fast and light and very, very small. "I have you," she told them without words, in the way warmth could be a language. "I have you and I will not let go." Kael stopped at a junction, 3 corridors splitting from a central point, the intersection marked by a torch bracket that was empty, the torch having been pulled for the emergency signal lighting elsewhere in the fortress. In the darkness, the sounds of the battle rearranged themselves into something with geography. The main gate fighting was to their left, the lower courtyard to the right, and from directly ahead came something that made Kael go still. Silence. Not the natural silence of an empty corridor. The pressed, held silence of something waiting. "Back," Kael said very quietly. They were not quick enough. The 3 wolves who came through the forward corridor were not in pack colors. They wore the dark, stripped-down tactical gear of an infiltration unit, wolves sent not to fight at the front but to move through a breached fortress and find what was most valuable inside. Their eyes moved past Kael with the assessment of professionals quantifying an obstacle and landed on the pups, and Sera watched the calculation complete itself in their faces, and she understood before any of them moved that these were the wolves who had been sent for exactly this, that Myra's message to the Riven Pack had included coordinates and a description and a purpose, and the purpose was in Sera's arms. Kael shifted. She did it fluidly and fast, her human form replaced in the space of 2 strides by a large, dark beta wolf who had apparently been waiting politely inside her human skin for exactly this situation. And she put herself between Sera and the 3 infiltrators with a competence and ferocity that bought Sera 10 seconds and a corridor junction and the instruction, delivered in a bark that had the precise quality of a command to run. Sera ran. She took the right-hand corridor because it was the only remaining option and because the sounds of the main battle were to the left and instinct said that carrying the Alpha's heirs toward the largest concentration of enemy wolves was not a survivable choice. The right corridor descended, she felt it in her legs and her lungs, a gradual grade that meant she was moving toward the fortress's lower levels, which meant cellars, which meant stone walls and narrow approaches and the kind of geography that favored someone small and alone over someone large and in force. She found the cellar door by feel in the dark and got it open and got through it and got it shut and got the wooden bar across it in the time it took her heart to beat 4 times. And then she stood in the absolute dark of a wine cellar with 2 pups pressed against her chest and her breath coming in controlled measures because panic was a luxury she could not currently afford. She listened. Above her, the bells still ringing. The distant crash and reverberation of the main fighting, the high reverberant sound of force meeting force, of a large number of wolves in the terrifying communion of a real battle. And underneath all of it, threading through the stone of the fortress itself like a current through water, she could feel him. She hadn't expected that. The bond was not supposed to be directional. The texts in the library had described it as perceptual, emotional, a resonance rather than a signal. But she could feel him the way she could feel weather coming. A pressure in the chest, a quality of the air. And what she felt was fury and strength, and something else that was beginning at the edges to acquire the color of pain. She pressed her back against the cellar wall and she breathed, and she thought about what she was doing and what she should do and what she was going to do, and she recognized with the tiredness of someone who has had this conversation with herself many times that these were not always the same thing. He is fighting a siege, she told herself. He is an alpha king with a trained army and the full resource of his fortress. He does not need you. Your function right now is to protect the pups. Stay here. Stay quiet. Wait. The pain at the edges of what she could feel through the bond grew. Stay here, she told herself. It grew more. I'm sorry, she whispered to Ashen River, who looked at her with eyes that caught no light because there was no light, and who said nothing, and who somehow managed to communicate complete understanding anyway. She moved the bar. She opened the door. She ran toward the pane. The main courtyard was hell rendered in firelight. She came out of the side entrance at a run and stopped for a fractional moment to process what her eyes were reporting, because her mind needed the moment to accept it. The courtyard she had crossed 4 days ago in the silent, hostile examination of a pack assessing a rogue was now a different geography entirely. The same stone, the same walls, the same iron gate, but inhabited by a chaos so complete and so loud and so full of motion that it had the quality of a natural disaster, of something happening rather than something being done. The Riven pack had breached the lower gate. There were more of them than she had imagined from the sound, 40, perhaps 50 wolves, in both shifted and unshifted form, engaging the Ashenvale defenders in the close, brutal arithmetic of fortress combat. Fire had caught on the stable roof to the east, the amber light of it turning the entire scene the color of old blood. The smell was iron and smoke and wolf and the sharp particular note of pack magic being discharged in combat, and it hit her like a wall. She found him by the pull in her chest. He was at the courtyard center, and he was what she had been told an alpha king at full fury looked like but had not, until this moment, fully believed. He had shifted, or half-shifted, in the way of the most powerful alphas, existing in the threshold form that was neither human nor wolf but something older than both, larger than either, the form that pack text described as the war shape and that she had privately considered to be mythological. He was enormous. He moved through the enemy wolves around him like weather moves through trees, and every wolf he touched went down and stayed down, and the Riven wolves who had been advancing from the lower gate had stopped advancing because something in their biology, below the level of decision, was asking them to reconsider. But they had numbers, and he was bleeding. She saw the wound from 40 feet away. How could she not, when her healer's perception had been attuned to him specifically by 4 days of proximity and one irrevocable bond, reading him the way she read everything she cared about, with a particular attention reserved for things whose loss was not survivable. The wound was in his side, below the ribs on the left, and it was deep, and the quality of how he was carrying it, the microscopic compensation in his movement, the way he was rotating away from it, told her more than the blood did. Something vital. Something that was currently operating on will and adrenaline and would not continue to do so indefinitely. She made a sound she had no name for. She put the pups down behind a stone column, pressed them back, held their eyes, communicated with every tool available to her that they were to stay, that this was not negotiable, and she ran. The battle parted for her in the way that battles sometimes parted for unexpected things. Not because she was large or armed or frightening, but because a small woman in a cellar dress running at full speed toward the center of active combat was so categorically improbable that it created a moment of confused space around her, a gap in the choreography of violence that she moved through before anyone had fully processed her presence. She reached him. Sera. Her name in his mouth was not a word. It was a sound that went straight to the bond and pulled, shock and fury and something raw underneath both. What are you? I told Kael to get you out. You're bleeding through your lungs, she said, her hands already on him, reading the wound through his shirt with fingers that knew what they were looking for. It was worse than the outside suggested. It was significantly worse. The blade was poisoned. Rivenpack uses Ashwood compound. I can feel it in the tissue. It's slowing the clotting. Go back. The authority in it was extraordinary even now, even with his voice carrying the compressed quality of someone managing real pain in real time. Take the pups and... Stop talking, she said, and stay still. She had never used the golden light like this. She had used it for a drowning child. She had used it for 2 hypothermic pups. She had used it in demonstration for a tribunal, controlled and measured and legible. She had never used it in an open courtyard in the middle of a siege at full capacity without limit, for a wound that was this far along. She had never had to. She put both hands on his wound and she opened every door she had ever kept locked and she let it come. The light was not subtle. It came out of her like a detonation, golden and white and vast, expanding outward from the point of contact with his wound in a wave that illuminated the entire courtyard in the space of a single second, washing over 50 wolves in the middle of a siege and stopping every single one of them with the comprehensive authority of something so outside the expected framework of experience that the body simply ceased all other activity in order to process it. The fighting stopped. The bells kept ringing for 3 more seconds and then whoever was pulling them stopped too. Sera was aware of none of this. She was inside the healing in the way she had never allowed herself to be inside it. Fully, without the protective distance she usually maintained, without the careful monitoring of her own output that kept her from giving too much. She had always held something back. A reserve. A survival instinct that said this far and no further. You still need enough left to keep your own heart beating. She felt that instinct now, running its usual calculations, and she felt herself override it with a totality that was not courageous. Courage implied a choice, implied the possibility of doing otherwise. This was not a choice. This was simply the only thing in the world that was currently happening. She poured herself into him. The wound was deep and poisoned and had been operating without intervention for too long, and healing it was not a single action but 1,000 simultaneous ones, chasing the Ashwood compound through his bloodstream and neutralizing it cell by cell, rebuilding tissue that had begun to break down, restoring the arterial integrity that was allowing him to bleed in places she couldn't see from the outside, finding the places where the poison had reached and pulling it back from them with a focused, furious tenderness that she could not have explained to anyone who had never loved something enough to fight for it at the cellular level. She felt when the wound began to close. She felt when the poison lost its hold. She felt, distantly, when her legs stopped supporting her weight. She didn't fall. He caught her, which she registered as information without being able to do much with it, because by that point the golden light had taken with it most of what she had available for processing information. She was aware of his arms, of the warmth of him that was coming back now, his body temperature rising as the healing restored the circulation the wound had been compromising. She was aware of the courtyard, the silence of it, the 50 wolves standing in the aftermath of the light with expressions she couldn't read because her vision had developed an imprecision she associated with significant output depletion. She was aware of him saying her name. Not the one-word command of the courtyard. Not the careful third-person management of the fortress. Her name the way it lived in the bond, the way it had always, she understood now, lived in the bond, waiting for him to let it out. Sera. The pups, she said or tried to. Her voice had the quality of something spoken from a significant distance. Column. East side. They're behind. I see them, he said. Close. Very close. I have them. The riven wolves. Look at the riven wolves, he said quietly. She looked. They were leaving. Not routing. Not the panicked, disordered retreat of a force that had been militarily defeated, though the Ashenvale defenders had clearly accounted for significant numbers before her light had stopped everything. They were leaving the way things left when they had encountered something that recategorized their understanding of what was possible. Several of them were still looking at her, or at the space where the light had been, with expressions that had bypassed ordinary threat assessment and gone straight to something older and more fundamental. The last of them went through the lower gate. The courtyard was quiet except for the fire on the stable roof, which was already being addressed by a chain of wolves with water, and the sound of the wounded being tended, and the bells finally falling silent one by one. She closed her eyes. She woke in a bed that was not the East Wing bed. She knew this before she opened her eyes, knew it from the quality of the mattress, from the warmth level that was significantly above what the East Wing fireplace produced, from the smell of the room, which was pine and wood smoke and old paper, and the resonant specific warmth that she had by now catalogued as thoroughly as she'd catalogued anything in her training. She opened her eyes. The Western Library. A day bed she hadn't noticed before pulled close to the fire. Through the wide south windows, a winter afternoon, the angle of the light suggesting several hours had passed since the siege, the courtyard below visible and ordinary and occupied by the normal activity of a pack doing the work of the morning after. He was in the chair beside her. He was alive. She knew this before she looked at him directly, knew it through the bond, which was warm and present and achingly clear in the aftermath of everything, whatever walls he'd been maintaining on his side having apparently been dismantled by events. He was alive and uninjured, which she verified with her healer's perception before she trusted it, checking the site of the wound through the simple fact of his presence and finding it closed and clean and permanent, and something inside her chest unclenched with a force that was almost painful. He was watching her. He had been watching her for some time, she thought. He had the expression of someone who has had several hours to sit with a series of realizations and has arrived, through the process of exhausted, solitary reckoning, at the far side of them. "You could have died," he said. His voice was not the alpha register. It was the other one, the one she'd heard only in the corridor with Mira and once in the library. The one without the scaffolding. The healer said your output depleted past the... "I know what it depleted past," she said. "Sera. You were dying," she said simply. "The Ashwood poison would have completed its work in another few minutes. I know what I did and I know what it cost and I would do it again, so if you're planning to have me tried under Northern law for unsanctioned..." "Stop." He leaned forward, and his elbows came to his knees, and he looked at her with amber eyes that were entirely, completely undefended. "I'm not planning a tribunal." "Then what are you planning?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "You healed me," he said. "In front of my entire pack. In front of 50 riven wolves. The light you produced, there are 3 accounts of anima aurea in the archive texts, and the scholars who documented them described the full expression as..." He stopped. "They described it as something that occurred only in the completion of a bond." He held her gaze. "Not the beginning of one." She said nothing. "The pups bonded to you in the forest," he said. "Before I arrived. Before I knew you were there." He paused. "And I have been..." Another pause, longer, the pause of a man being honest about something at considerable personal cost. "I have been aware of you since the forest. In the way I have not been aware of anything since." He didn't finish the sentence. She understood the shape of what it contained. "You don't have to say it," she said quietly. "I know I don't." He looked at her for a long moment, and the amber was very warm, and the bond moved between them with the slow, enormous, patient energy of something that had been waiting years for exactly this configuration of people in exactly this room. "I want to." Outside, the winter afternoon was pale and clear, and the snow on the courtyard below was unmarked, and somewhere in the fortress 2 small wolves were presumably dismantling something or demanding food or sleeping in a configuration that defied the geometry of their size. She reached across the space between them. She put her hand over his. He turned his palm upward and closed his fingers around hers with the careful, absolute certainty of someone who has made a decision they are finished arguing with, and she felt it complete. The bond, the long arc of it, the thing that had begun in a frozen forest over 2 dying pups and had run through every hostile corridor and every careful distance and every almost and every not yet, felt it settle into place with the quiet, permanent sound of something that had always been true finally, being said aloud. "My name is Kael," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. She had learned it from Kaelin on the second day, and had not let herself use it until now. "Say it," he said. She understood what he was asking. The bond, spoken in names, was different from the bond unspoken. It was the old way, older than pack law, older than tribunals and rank designations and the long, elaborate architecture of hierarchy that had been built over the top of something much more fundamental. "Kael," she said. The fire burned warm and steady. Outside, the winter held the world in its careful, indifferent grip, and inside the library of Ashenvale Citadel, an Omega with gold in her hands and a rejection brand on her neck and 3 weeks of exile in her bones sat beside a king who had reorganized his entire interior life around the certainty that he was finished needing things, and they held on, and the bond held them, and the story that had begun with 2 whimpers in the snow arrived, finally, at the only place it had ever been. Heading home. The morning after the siege arrived like an apology. The sky over Ashenvale cleared for the first time in weeks, a pale, luminous blue that had no business being as beautiful as it was, given what the night had contained. The snow in the courtyard was unmarked and clean where it had not been touched, and the places where it had been touched bore the complex, churned record of everything that had happened, and the pack moved through both kinds of snow with the quiet, purposeful energy of people doing the necessary work of the day after. Clearing, repairing, tending the wounded, accounting for the living with the thorough, unrushed attention of a community that understood what it had almost lost. Sera stood at the wide library window and watched them. She had slept again after Kael left, after he had held her hand for an hour without speaking while the fire burned down and her body made its steady, stubborn case for recovery, and had then pressed his lips to her knuckles with a brevity that was more devastating than any extended gesture could have been, and said "sleep," in the voice that was not the command voice but the other one, the one that lived below all of it, and she had slept. She felt fragile in the way of things that have been used at their full extent and are now recalibrating. Not broken, she was very clear with herself about the distinction. Fragile was temporary. Fragile was the morning after you had given everything, before the everything began to come back. She had been through worse recalibrations than this in 3 weeks of exile, and she had emerged from all of them and she would emerge from this one. She watched the pack move through the courtyard below and she thought about what came next. The legal situation was not resolved. She was still, technically, an unaffiliated rogue within pack territory, operating under a suspended tribunal outcome that had not been formally closed. The golden healing she had unleashed in the courtyard was not a controlled, witnessed demonstration of benign intent. It was a full, unrestrained discharge of an unsanctioned gift in a context that Northern law could reasonably frame as interference with pack affairs. Mira was still somewhere in this fortress. And, said the practical, survival-oriented part of her that had kept her alive through 22 days of winter exile, Kael holding your hand in the library and saying his own name is not the same as a formal claiming, and until it is, you are exactly as legally vulnerable as you were yesterday. She heard the door. Not Kaelin. The weight of the footsteps was different, heavier, deliberate, carrying the particular quality of intention rather than task. She turned from the window. Kael stood in the library doorway, and he was in full formal dress, which she had learned in 4 days to read as armor, the dark, severe, exquisitely maintained clothing of a king conducting official business. The rank insignia she'd never seen him wear voluntarily now present on his collar. His bearing carrying the comprehensive authority of a man who had decided something and was moving toward it with the focused momentum of a force that had resolved its internal argument. Behind him she could see them. The pack. Not all of them. The library corridor could not have held all of them, but a significant portion, filling the passage as far back as she could see, arranged not in the formal complaint configuration of the tribunal petition but in something else entirely, something with a different geometry and a different quality of silence. Waiting. Sera. He crossed the room to her, and she stood at the window and held his gaze and did not manage her expression because she was too tired to manage her expression and also because she had decided, somewhere in the sleeping hours, that she was finished with the performance of being smaller than she was. The pack has asked to be present, he said. I told them the decision was mine. He paused. But I thought you should be able to see them. Why? She asked. He stepped aside. Through the library doorway, she looked at the wolves who had despised her, who had delivered food to her floor and locked her door and arranged themselves into a formal tribunal petition designed to send her back into a winter that would have killed her. She looked at the beta who had escorted her to the east wing with the closed face of a man following distasteful orders. She looked at two young Omega women who had been among the most hostile in the corridors, who had stepped back from her with the instinctive recoil of the pack refusing contamination. They were on their knees. Not all of them, and she would not have trusted it if they had been, because unanimity in a crowd that size was performance rather than truth. But most of them, the significant majority, arranged in the corridor on their knees with their heads lowered in the position that pack tradition reserved for the acknowledgement of power so absolute that argument was not possible. The position of recognition, not submission. There was a difference. She had read about it in the archive texts on the second day. Submission said, "You have defeated me." Recognition said, "I see what you are." The beta who had carried her food to the floor met her eyes when she looked at him. He was on his knees, and his expression was not ashamed exactly, but it contained an accounting, a reckoning with something he had gotten wrong. He held her gaze without flinching. She looked at them for a long moment. She thought about the forest and the two whimpers in the snow, and the 30 seconds she had stood at the edge of the decision before her body made it for her. She thought about 7 years of making herself small. She thought about the tribunal and the brand and the flat sound of a bolt engaging in the east wing door. She thought about gold light in a winter courtyard and a king saying her name for the first time in the library afterward. She looked back at Kael. He was watching her with the amber-warm, undefended directness that she was still learning to receive, that she thought she might spend a significant amount of time learning to receive, because it was a specific and overwhelming thing, being seen by someone who had the capacity to see at that depth. "There's something I need to do first," he said. He turned to face the corridor, to face his pack, kneeling in the passage with their heads lowered, and the quality of his presence shifted in the way she'd been watching it shift for 4 days. From the managed authority of a king conducting his fortress to the full, unmediated weight of what he actually was. She felt it move through the corridor like a tide. 4 days ago, he said, and his voice was the voice that carried through stone, a rogue Omega entered this territory and healed my sons in the snow at the cost of her own remaining strength. She stood before a tribunal in this hall and proved her innocence without advocates, without rank, without anything except the truth. He paused. She endured 4 days in a fortress that did not welcome her with a quality of dignity that shamed us. And last night she put her hands on my wound and gave what she had left, past the safe limit, past the survivable limit, and she brought me back. Another pause longer. She is not a rogue. She has never been a rogue. What she is cannot be contained by that designation or any other that we have previously employed. The corridor was absolutely silent. Northern law requires a formal declaration in the presence of witnesses, he said. I'm told 50 is sufficient. I count considerably more than 50. He turned back to her. And here was the thing that she had not been prepared for, the thing that the practical, survival-oriented part of her had not accounted for. He was nervous. She could see it, in the precise, deliberate management of his breathing, in the almost imperceptible tension at the corners of his eyes, in the quality of his stillness that was not the stillness of certainty but the stillness of someone standing at the edge of something significant and looking down. Kael. Not the Alpha King. Kael, the man who had lost someone 9 years ago and had organized his entire interior architecture around the certainty that he was finished needing things, standing in front of her with all of that architecture quietly, irreversibly dismantled, asking something of the universe that he had not asked it in a very long time. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. She felt him exhale. Sera of no pack, he said, and his voice was only just steady, and she loved him for the effort it took to make it so. I claim you as mine. As equal. As Luna of Ashenvale, with every right and every protection and every power that designation carries. He turned his face into her hand, a small instinctive motion, the wolf in him speaking more honestly than the king could quite manage. And I ask you, he said, to claim me back. Not as your alpha. As yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Kael, she said, I claimed you in a cellar in the dark when I picked up your sons and ran toward the fighting instead of away from it. I claimed you when I put my hands on your wound. She held his gaze. I have been claiming you since the forest. Something in his face broke open, not apart, not into damage, but the way light broke open through a gap in winter clouds. Sudden and enormous and irreversible, illuminating everything it touched with a particular quality of warmth that had been temporarily withheld and now arrived with the accumulated force of all its waiting. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the careful, tentative kiss of people who are not yet certain, who are testing the idea of each other, checking the temperature of something new. It was the kiss of a man who had been conducting a very long argument with himself and had lost it comprehensively, who had 4 days of deliberate distance and 1 night of almost losing everything converted into a single point of contact, and all of that landed in the press of his mouth against hers with a conviction so absolute that she felt it in her sternum. She kissed him back with everything she had, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, the accumulated force of 7 years of making herself small and 3 weeks of surviving what should have been unsurvivable and 4 days of being in proximity to him and managing, with enormous effort, to maintain the appropriate distance from something she wanted with a specificity that had frightened her with its clarity. She was done managing appropriate distances. His hands came to her face, both of them cradling her jaw with the same extraordinary care she'd watched him use with his sons, the juxtaposition of the size of him and the gentleness of the gesture producing the same effect it always did, moving through her like a note struck perfectly on a resonant instrument. She felt the bond complete its final architecture, the last of whatever had been held back on both sides releasing simultaneously in the way of things that had been waiting for permission. The golden light came without her choosing it. Just warmth, not the vast deployed power of the courtyard, nothing clinical or purposeful, but the ambient involuntary glow of a gift expressing joy rather than intent. It rose through her skin like dawn and touched him, and she felt him receive it the way he had received everything she'd given him, with a totality of attention that made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, that being fully seen was not a threat. From the corridor a sound. She registered it distantly, through the bond and the warmth and the specific consuming reality of his hands on her face. A sound that built from one voice to several to many, moving through the assembled pack in the corridor and spreading, she would learn later, through the fortress and into the courtyard and across the walls to the watchtowers. Not a cheer. Cheering was too thin a word for what it was. It was the sound a community made when something that had been wrong for a long time became right. A collective exhale of attention so long maintained that the relief of releasing it had a volume. He broke the kiss slowly. He rested his forehead against hers. "Luna," he said. Quietly, the word for her alone first before it was for anyone else. She closed her eyes. "Don't make me cry in front of your pack," she said. A breath that was almost a laugh, she felt it against her lips. "They're your pack." She opened her eyes. He pulled back just far enough to look at her, and she looked at him, and behind him the corridor was still full of wolves who were on their feet now, who were making that sound, who were watching a rogue Omega with a rejection brand on her neck stand in the library of their king with golden light on her skin and both his hands on her face, and whose bodies were doing what bodies did when the pack bond updated with new information, accepting it, integrating it, reorganizing the architecture of their collective identity around a new fact. She had a pack. She stood inside the sudden, specific, almost unbearable reality of this. The pack bond, which had been severed from her 7 years in the making and 3 weeks executed, offering itself back. Not the Iron Veil bond, not the specific warmth of that particular community, but something larger and newer and hers in a way that was entirely different from the one she'd been born into. She felt it at the edges of her perception, tentative and genuine, 230 wolves extending the threads of collective awareness toward her like hands offered rather than forced. She took them. The bond completed. She gasped. She couldn't help it, the sensation of it too large for a controlled response, the return of something she had lived so long without that she had forgotten the specific quality of its presence, like light in a room that has been dark long enough that you have stopped expecting light. Kael's arms came around her. Full, unguarded, the embrace of someone who has stopped performing restraint because the performance has become too expensive and the alternative has become too necessary. She pressed her face into his chest and she breathed him in, pine and wood smoke and that deep, ancient warmth that was his specific frequency in the world. And she felt River and Ash arrive at her knees approximately 4 seconds later, because they had been somewhere in the corridor and had apparently decided that the situation had reached a stage requiring their direct participation. And the sound they made winding around her ankles was the sound of small creatures who are in possession of everything they want. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, its own size and its own sound, something she had not heard from herself in a very long time. It came out of her like the golden light came out of her. Involuntary, uncontainable, expressing something her body had decided it was finished keeping in reserve. Kael looked down at her when she laughed. He looked at her the way the library looked in the afternoon, when the south windows caught the winter sun and the whole room went warm and amber and alive with it, with a specific quality of warmth that came from a source that had always been present but had only recently been allowed to express its full capacity. Later, much later, when she was the Luna they wrote about in the archive texts, the one the historical accounts described in language that would have embarrassed her in the present tense, she would try to identify the precise moment she had stopped being a rogue and started being this. She would turn the question over in thoughtful, quiet moments, trying to locate the boundary. She would conclude eventually that there wasn't one. There was only the forest and the whimper in the snow, and the choice her body had made before her mind had caught up. The choice that was not a strategy or a calculation or an act of survival but simply the oldest, most fundamental expression of what she was. Someone who could not walk past a small thing dying in the cold. Every subsequent thing had been the consequence of that first unguarded, irrevocable moment of turning toward rather than away. She had not been walking toward safety when she turned. She had been walking toward this. Kael pressed his lips to her temple. Her hair, her forehead, the corner of her eye with a particular devotion of someone relearning the geography of tenderness after a long time away from it. He held her with the totality of someone who had spent 9 years perfecting the discipline of not holding on, and who was now discovering, somewhat to his own undoing, that the discipline was entirely reversible when the right person made reversing it feel like the most natural thing in the world. "I have something for you," he murmured against her hair. She pulled back enough to look at him. He reached into the inner pocket of his formal coat and produced a slim band of worked silver, not elaborate, not ostentatious, nothing like Myra's rank ring with its deliberate ornament. Simple and old and clearly significant, the silver worn smooth with age, set with a single piece of amber that caught the library firelight and held it. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "Before she was Luna, she was a healer. Ranked Omega, Ashenvale born. The amber is from the original territory before the fortress was built." He looked at her. "I was told it would find the right hand eventually. I stopped believing that. Pause. I was wrong about a number of things." She held out her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger, and the amber caught the light, and it was warm, genuinely, materially warm, in the way of old pack magic objects that had been held and loved and imbued with the accumulated warmth of long belonging. It sat on her hand as though it had always been there, as though the hand had been waiting for it. "Equal," he said. "Not a question." "Equal," she agreed. Outside the library windows, the winter afternoon was pale and clear and very beautiful, and the pack in the courtyard below had begun the work of the new day with a particular quality of energy that followed the resolution of long uncertainty, purposeful and warm, and occasionally, from individual clusters, rising into the specific laughter of people who are relieved. The stable roof was being repaired. The lower gate was being reinforced. Children who had been kept inside during the siege had been released into the courtyard and were performing the timeless activity of small creatures in fresh snow with complete commitment and no apparent awareness of the historical significance of the moment occurring 60 feet above them in the library. River and Ash had colonized the day bed and were doing what small wolves did in the aftermath of significant events. Sleeping with the comprehensive, boundary-dissolving commitment of the truly exhausted, a tangle of dark fur and small size that occupied roughly 3 times the space their size suggested was available. Sera stood in the warm library of her home, in her pack, beside the man who had asked her name in a winter forest and had not yet, even now, entirely recovered from the asking, and she felt the rejection brand on the back of her neck. She always would, probably. Some marks did not fade. But it was the smallest thing in the room. The smallest thing in the room. She turned to face the window and the winter afternoon and all of it, the vast, patient, incomprehensible complexity of the life that was now hers, and she let herself feel it fully, without management or distance or the protective architecture of a woman who has learned to want carefully. She let it be large. She let it be everything. The golden light came up through her hands without being asked, and the room went warm and amber and alive with it, and Kael stood at her shoulder and said nothing at all, because nothing was required, because some things did not need language, they needed only presence and witness, and the particular quality of stillness that existed between two people who have found, after long and separate journeys through the cold, that they were always walking toward the same place. Home. Always home. 3 years changed everything and nothing and all the right things. The snow still fell on Ashenvale. It always would. The Northern Territories were not in the business of moderating themselves for anyone's comfort, and the winters came with the same indifferent, beautiful severity that they always had, blanketing the forest and the courtyard and the high fortress walls in the same clean, impartial white. The cold still had teeth. The pines still held their darkness past the treeline like a secret. But the courtyard was different now. Sera stood at the wide library window, her window in her library in her home, with both hands resting against the full warm curve of her belly, and she watched her sons play in the snow below. They were not small anymore. That was the thing she had not been prepared for, how quickly they would become themselves, distinct and vivid and entirely their own, how rapidly the two dark pups she had held against her chest in a frozen forest would resolve into these specific, irreplaceable people. Ash was 6 now, and he had his father's gravity, that quality of watchful, self-contained attention that made you feel, when he looked at you, that he was reading something several pages ahead of the current moment. He moved through the courtyard with a purposefulness that made the older pack members exchange glances and quiet, satisfied smiles. River was everything his name had always suggested. He was motion and momentum and the particular brand of fearless curiosity that regularly produced situations requiring adult intervention. He was, at this present moment, attempting to teach 3 younger pack pups a game that appeared to involve significant quantities of snow and a system of rules that only he fully understood, and his laughter carried up to the library window with the clear, percussive joy of a child who had never once in his remembered life doubted that the world was fundamentally safe. She had given them that. She held this knowledge quietly, the way she held the most important things, not tightly, not with display, but with the deep, settled certainty of something true. Kael's arms came around her from behind. She had not heard him enter, she never did, and she had long since stopped being startled by it, had simply incorporated the warmth of his sudden presence into the ordinary texture of her days, the way you incorporated the warmth of a fire you trusted to always be lit. He was careful of the baby the way he was careful of all things he loved, with his whole attention in both hands and no performative gentleness, just the real kind, the kind that came from the accurate understanding of what something was worth. His chin came to rest against her temple. "She's been moving," Sera said. "She." A smile in his voice. "She." Sera covered his hands with hers. "I know." He didn't argue. He had learned, 3 years into being loved by a woman whose gift for reading living things extended significantly past the merely observable, that she generally did. Below, Ash had apparently said something judicial about River's game, because River had turned to his brother with an expression of comprehensive betrayal that dissolved, for seconds later, into the particular wrestling-based conflict resolution that the twins had employed since they were old enough to have physical opinions. They went into the snow together in a tangle of limbs and laughter, and 2 of the younger pups immediately joined the pile, and the resulting scene had the chaotic, wholehearted quality of children who are completely, entirely happy. Sera felt the baby move, a slow, rolling shift, an elbow or a knee pressing outward against her palm with the unhurried confidence of a creature that had decided the world outside was probably ready for her. "Not yet," Sera told her softly. "A few more weeks." Kael pressed his lips to her hair. The amber ring on her finger caught the afternoon light. It always did in this window at this hour, the old pack magic in it responding to the sun with a warmth that was entirely out of proportion to its size. She had worn it for 3 years and it still felt, every morning, like something given rather than something owned. Like grace. Like the specific, unearned quality of the life that had been waiting at the end of a walk she had been taking without knowing its destination. She thought about the woman she had been in that forest. Thin and cold and stripped of everything, rank, pack, safety, the future she had planned. Walking away from what had hurt her and toward nothing in particular, following a frozen creek bed in the dark because it was the only path available and she was too stubborn to stop. She thought about 2 whimpers in the snow. She thought about turning. "What are you thinking?" Kael asked. She looked at the courtyard, at her sons, snow-covered and laughing, at the pack members pausing in their afternoon work to watch them with the fond, proprietary warmth of a community that had claimed these children as its own. She looked at the fortress walls, dark stone against a winter sky that was turning, at its edges, the pale gold of late afternoon. She felt the baby and the bond and his arms and the ring warm against her finger. That I would do it again, she said. Every part of it. He held her closer. Outside, River won whatever the game had been, or decided he had, which amounted to the same thing, and his victory cry lifted over the courtyard walls and into the cold, clear air of the northern winter, bright and alive and entirely fearless. The sun moved lower. The gold deepened. And the snow fell on Ashenvale as it always had, indifferent and beautiful and no longer merciless at all.